the cavernous, hallowed grandeur of Westminster Abbey. On this particular, extraordinary autumn morning in 1396, is a living, breathing entity. Forget the hushed reverence of a modern tourist visit, the solemn, silent monument it stands as today, its ancient stones worn smooth by the ceaseless passage of centuries and countless feet. Instead, conjure it alive, throbbing with the vibrant, tumultuous, and often brutal spirit of the late 14th century. The very air within its monumental, soaring stone walls, typically cool and still, is thick, almost palpable, with a complex, dizzying tapestry of interwoven scents, the sharp, metallic tang of cold, damp stone, the heady, earthy perfume of freshly cut rushes meticulously strewn across the flagstone floor, the cloying, almost suffocating sweetness of thousands upon thousands of flickering beeswax candles, their collective glow battling the dim, gray light filtering through stained glass windows, and subtly, almost imperceptibly, the nervous anticipation of 1,000 onlookers, a collective breath held in the vast, echoing naive, a tangible energy that precedes a momentous, destiny-altering event. It hums, almost vibrates, with a ceaseless murmur of hushed whispers that ripple through the packed gathering, punctuated by the luxurious rustle of silks and velvets, the coarser rasp of wool and linen, and the occasional jarring clank of a knight's armor as a guard shifts his weight. It is the chilly morning of November 13th, 1396. Across the entire expanse of Western Europe, two great powers, two ancient kingdoms, England and France, bitter, bloodied enemies for over half a century, in the devastating, seemingly unending saga of the 100 Years' War, are attempting to forge a fragile, desperate truce, a peace treaty so desperately sought, so strategically vital, that it is to be sealed not merely with ink on parchment, not just with solemn oaths between seasoned diplomats, but with the fragile, almost sacred innocence of a child. On that cold, momentous, and utterly surreal day, a grand, stately procession slowly, deliberately makes its way down the ancient, deeply worn aisle. The echoes of their footsteps are swallowed by the overwhelming vastness of the cathedral's nave, absorbed by the heavy hangings and the murmuring crowd. At its head, striding with a curious, almost contradictory blend of inherent regal authority and a discernible weariness that seems to cling to his fine robes, resplendent in gold brocade woven with intricate patterns, trimmed with swathes of precious ermine fur, walks King Richard II of England. He is a man of 29 years, perhaps slightly shorter than one might expect for a reigning monarch, but possessing an undeniable, almost magnetic presence, a reputation for both profound artistic sensitivity and a famously mercurial, often volatile, temper. His eyes, a piercing, almost startling shade of blue, perhaps betray a flicker of distant sorrow, a shadow of the immense weight of a crown he inherited as a mere boy, a life already defined by both immense expectations and profound personal tragedy. He moves with a deliberate, almost ceremonial pace, his gaze fixed straight ahead, betraying little of his inner thoughts. But who walks beside him, or rather, whose tiny, delicate hand is almost entirely lost within his larger gloved one, her small figure barely reaching his waist? It is a little girl, diminutive for her age, her slender frame almost entirely swallowed, completely lost beneath the voluminous, heavy, richly embroidered robes of white and gold, specially fashioned for this momentous day. Her gown is adorned with the intricate symbols of both the English and French royal houses, the three lions of England, the fleur-de-lis of France, intertwined in a forced symbolic unity, Her face, framed by a delicate linen coif and a veil of fine silk, is small, unlined by worry, yet her expression is one of profound vulnerability. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of childlike wonder, perhaps a nascent fear, and certainly a deep, innocent bewilderment, nervously take in the overwhelming vastness of the cathedral, the dizzying height of its vaulted ceilings, the blur of unfamiliar, often stern or calculating faces that line the aisle, row upon row of English lords and ladies, many of whom regard her with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and cold calculation. This is Isabella of Valois, the youngest surviving daughter of Charles VI, the Mad King of France, and on this day, barely 6 years old, she is being married to the King of England. A 6-year-old child, a mere wisp of a girl, forced to plight her troth, to swear solemn oaths of loyalty and obedience, words she can barely understand, let alone internalize, to a man more than 4 times her age, a king whose very realm was, until recently, locked in a brutal, unending, generations-long war with her father's kingdom. This isn't a whimsical fairy tale where innocence triumphs over adversity, where love conquers all. This isn't even a particularly happy chapter in the grand, tumultuous saga of English or French history. No, this is a chilling, unvarnished glimpse into the forgotten, often brutal, and profoundly unsettling realities of medieval royal marriages, where children were not individuals with rights, desires, or personal agency, but were rather mere pawns in a colossal, dangerous, and often deadly game of political chess. Their personal happiness, their very childhoods, their fundamental right to a carefree existence, were utterly sacrificed on the altar of dynastic expediency, national security, territorial ambition, and the desperate, cynical calculus of power. It is the poignant, often tragic story of a truly forgotten queen, a child bride, whose fleeting, tumultuous time on the English throne was marked by an unexpected, tender bond, but ultimately consumed by devastating political upheaval and profound personal loss. Her story, despite its inherent drama, has been largely overshadowed, relegated to the margins of history books. Before we delve into the extraordinary and at times heartbreaking life of Isabella of Valois, this young queen, whose name often echoes only faintly in the grand halls of history, whose portrait is rarely found in the popular imagination, I want to invite you, my audience, to fully join this immersive journey through time. Where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute on a train, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life in a busy city? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your engagement truly helps us continue to unearth these often forgotten, yet utterly crucial, historical narratives, to give voice to those whose stories have been obscured by the passage of time or the shadow of more important figures. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient narratives, these deep, sometimes disturbing secrets, together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the hidden corners of history, those intimate, private truths that so profoundly shaped public destinies. What you're about to hear isn't just another dry historical account, a mere recitation of dates, names, and battles. No, this is a profound, poignant, and unsettling human story. The chilling account of how a little girl, barely out of infancy, her mind still grappling with the simplest concepts of the world, was thrust into the very heart of a volatile, dangerous political landscape. She was a child burdened with the impossible weight of securing the fate of 2 warring nations, a tiny figure on a grand stage whose innocent life became irrevocably entangled with the dramatic, almost Shakespearean, downfall of a king. This is the mystery of the forgotten queen, Isabella of Valois, a life defined by the cold calculus of power, the fleeting warmth of unexpected affection, the brutal loss of innocence, and ultimately by the crushing, relentless weight of circumstance. Let's peel back the thick, suffocating layers of centuries and secrecy and uncover the young woman behind the crown, the child behind the political pawn, the enduring spirit behind the forgotten name, the pawn of peace, Isabella's gilded childhood and preordained destiny. To truly comprehend the profound anomaly, the sheer audacity, and the ultimate tragedy of Isabella's marriage, one must first transport oneself back to the specific world into which she was born, and understand from the very beginning the chilling reality of her inherent purpose. Isabella of Valois first drew breath in November 1389 at the Royal Chateau de Vincennes, just outside the bustling medieval sprawl of Paris. She was the eldest surviving daughter of Charles VI, then celebrated as the beloved King of France, and his formidable, politically astute, and often controversial queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman known for her love of luxury and her fierce protectiveness of her children. Isabella's birth occurred during a period of what could only be described as precarious, almost illusory peace, a brief, fragile respite in the midst of the devastating, seemingly unending saga of the 100 Years' War. This relentless, brutal conflict had, by this point, raged for over half a century, tearing apart the social fabric of both France and England, leaving behind a horrific trail of death, economic destruction, and deeply entrenched animosity that permeated every level of society, from the highest noble to the lowliest peasant. From the tender age of infancy, Isabella's life was never truly her own. She was not born to simply be loved and nurtured for herself. She was, from the very moment of her birth, a supremely valuable political asset, a living, breathing bargaining chip in the intricate, often ruthless, and utterly cynical game of European diplomacy that defined relations between kingdoms. Her nurseries at the sprawling, magnificent French royal palaces, whether it was the ancient, formidable Louvre in Paris, or the more comfortable, almost idyllic Chateau de Vincennes, would have been opulent beyond measure. They would have been filled with the softest silks for swaddling, exquisitely carved wooden toys, meticulously crafted by master artisans, and a constant doting, yet professional attention from an army of wet nurses, governesses, and ladies-in-waiting, all charged with safeguarding her health and preparing her for her inevitable role. She would have been dressed in miniature versions of courtly finery, her days filled with early lessons in piety, basic literacy, focused on devotional texts, and perhaps courtly French, and the strict, almost suffocating etiquette demanded of a princess of France. Yet, beneath this gilded, seemingly idyllic facade, lay the chilling, unassailable reality. Her entire future, her very identity, her every breath would be dictated not by personal affection, nascent desires, or individual choice, but by the cold, calculating strategic needs of the French crown. She was implicitly, if not explicitly, taught from her earliest years that her singular purpose in life was to serve the glory, the stability, and the territorial ambitions of France, and that this sacred duty might, at any moment, lead her anywhere, to anyone, across any border, into any circumstance. While Isabella was barely out of toddlerhood, still learning to form coherent sentences, still playing innocently with her porcelain dolls and wooden soldiers, the hushed, complex negotiations for her marriage had already quietly begun across the Channel. Richard II of England, a king desperately seeking to end the draining, seemingly endless 100 Years' War, and perhaps even more pressingly, to stabilize his own increasingly tumultuous and challenged reign, saw a dynastic alliance with France as the ultimate indispensable solution. Richard's personal life had recently been touched by profound tragedy. He had lost his deeply beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, to the terrifying, indiscriminately sweeping plague in June 1394. This had been a devastating blow that had plunged the king into a deep, prolonged, and almost incapacitating grief. Anne had been a popular queen, a source of stability and affection for Richard, and her death left a profound void, not just in his heart, but in the political landscape, as she had borne him no children. Yet the unrelenting practicalities of royal succession and the dire need for national peace demanded that he remarry swiftly to secure the future of his realm, to provide an heir, and to prevent renewed costly conflict. The very idea of marrying a child, particularly one as young as 6-year-old Isabella, seems profoundly shocking and morally questionable by modern standards. Indeed, even by some contemporary chroniclers who noted the extreme youth. But in the ruthless calculus of medieval European royalty, such unions, though rare for a reigning monarch of Richard's standing, were not entirely unheard of for high nobility. A young bride, barely out of the cradle, offered the tantalizing long-term promise of many years of potential fertility, ensuring a robust lineage for generations to come, a critical factor given the high rates of infant mortality and adult disease. And crucially, her extreme youth offered a prolonged period of immediate political stability, as she would not be old enough to exert any immediate political influence, to bring in an established faction, or to challenge the existing power structures. She could be molded, taught, and integrated into the English court without presenting an immediate threat to the established order. Moreover, the youth of the bride, particularly one from a powerful, recently warring family, minimized the immediate perceived threat of a new foreign queen wielding significant political power, or bringing in a strong, potentially destabilizing, established faction of her own. She was, in essence, a blank slate, an easily moldable asset in the delicate dance of international diplomacy. For Charles VI, the Mad King of France, marrying his cherished daughter to the King of England was an extraordinary gamble, a desperate, almost reckless attempt to secure a much-needed, long-term peace at a time when his own fragile mental health was beginning its tragic and terrifying decline. His episodes of delusion, paranoia, and terrifying violence were becoming more frequent and severe, plunging the French court into increasing disarray and making consistent governance almost impossible. He desperately needed a reprieve from the ceaseless pressures of war, a chance for his kingdom to heal, to breathe, to allow for internal stability. Richard's offer, despite the alarming age disparity, represented a chance for a desperately needed, long-term truce, a respite from the devastating conflict that had bled both nations dry. And so, the negotiations proceeded with cold, unfeeling efficiency, driven solely by the ruthless logic of statesmanship, utterly disregarding the welfare, the understanding, or the emotional state of the little girl whose entire life, whose very being, was being decided for her. She was a political prize, nothing more, nothing less. Imagine, if you can, the profound confusion, the terror, and the bewildering speed of events for Isabella. One day, she is playing innocently with her porcelain dolls and intricately carved wooden soldiers in the sunlit royal nurseries of Paris, surrounded by the comforting sounds of her native French tongue, by familiar doting faces, by the very scents and textures of home, a cocoon of childhood. The next, she is being meticulously prepared, her hair brushed, her tiny body fitted into suffocatingly elaborate robes for an arduous, terrifying journey across the churning, unpredictable sea, away from everything and everyone she knows, her entire universe uprooted. She is to marry a man she has never met, a king old enough to be her father, the ruler of a cold, distant land that had been her country's bitterest, most relentless foe for generations. Her innocence, her very childhood, her laughter and games, all were the explicit price of peace, the sacrificial lamb offered up on the ancient, blood-stained altar of Anglo-French diplomacy. She was too young to fully comprehend the enormity of her destiny, but she was certainly old enough to feel the chilling, isolating weight of it, the profound sense of dislocation and loss. She would carry that weight for the rest of her short, poignant life. The royal wedding, a ceremony of contradictions and calculated grandeur. The journey from the comfortable, familiar confines of Paris to the bustling port of Calais, and then the treacherous, often brutal crossing of the English Channel to the alien shores of England, would have been a grand, meticulously planned, but utterly bewildering and exhausting affair for little Isabella. This was no ordinary family trip. It was a state procession, a diplomatic convoy of immense significance. She was not alone, however. To ease her transition and maintain a semblance of familiarity, she was accompanied by a vast protective retinue of French courtiers, anxious ladies-in-waiting, trusted servants, and even her personal chaplain, all carefully chosen by her mother, Queen Isabeau, to create a familiar cocoon of French language, customs, and faces around her as she stepped into the terrifying unknown. They moved slowly, deliberately, a magnificent, slow-moving caravan across the French countryside, through villages whose inhabitants would have lined the roads, agog at the sheer spectacle. The culminating meeting between the two great kings, Charles VI of France and Richard II of England, was staged with extraordinary pomp and circumstance on the borderlands near Calais, a neutral, liminal space chosen for its strategic convenience. It was a spectacle designed purely to impress, to project an image of newfound harmony and power, a carefully choreographed public performance of peace after decades of bitter, bloody war. Imagine the scene: two magnificent royal tents, shimmering with gold and heraldry, each displaying the full might and artistic splendor of their respective courts, erected specifically for the meeting. Around them, thousands of armed men, English archers, French knights, stood in disciplined ranks, their polished armor glinting, a stark, silent reminder of the still present military might and the fragile nature of the peace being forged. But for Isabella, nestled within her retinue, it was the momentous, terrifying instant she met her future husband for the very first time. What did she make of this tall, imposing man, nearly 3 decades her senior, with a short, neatly trimmed beard that framed a sometimes nervous tick in his cheek, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold a vast, unknowable sorrow, a weariness beyond his years? What thoughts, if any, could possibly race through the mind of a 6-year-old child as this man, this formidable king, suddenly became her husband, her new protector, her entire future? Contemporary accounts and later historical analyses, though sparse on Isabella's direct thoughts, suggest that Richard, despite his growing reputation for haughtiness and an increasingly regal detachment that often alienated his own subjects, treated his child bride with an unexpected, almost tender gentleness. Perhaps he saw in her unblemished innocence, her delicate fragility, a poignant reflection of his own recent, profound grief over the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, who had provided him with such solace and companionship. The wedding ceremony itself, held with lavish pomp an extraordinary expense at Calais. In a temporary but exquisitely decorated wooden chapel erected specifically for the historic event was a tableau of stark, almost painful contradictions. Imagine the sensory overload for the little girl. The rich, heavy tapestries woven with scenes of mythical heroes and pious saints swaying gently in the unseen drafts from the hastily constructed walls. The hundreds of flickering candles, each a small flame of hope, casting dancing shadows across the vaulted wooden ceiling. The solemn, unintelligible Latin incantations, intoned by a phalanx of bishops and cardinals, their voices echoing in the temporary structure, the luxurious rustle of ceremonial robes, the clang of a censer swinging, releasing clouds of sweet-smelling frankincense. And at the very heart of it all, a 6-year-old girl, dwarfed by her surroundings, by the weight of her destiny, robed in the heaviest and richest of silks, her tiny hand almost swallowed by the larger gloved hand of a grown man, an absolute monarch in full, glittering royal regalia. She was far too young to comprehend the complex political machinations, the grand terms of the peace treaty, the 28 years' truce of Paris as it was known, the fragile truce that was so precariously dependent on her innocent person. She was marrying for a truce, for an end to bloodshed, for a kingdom, for a dynastic legacy, certainly not for love, nor even for companionship in any conventional sense. She was a living, breathing symbol, an emblem of a profound political aspiration, a literal bond between former enemies. Following the ceremony, a formal, yet even more bewildering journey awaited Isabella as she was escorted across the channel, that often treacherous stretch of water, to the alien shores of England. Her ship would have been a sturdy, if uncomfortable cog, rocking gently on the waves, watched over by a fleet of escort vessels. Her formal entry into London in January 1397, less than 2 months after her marriage, would have been a dazzling, overwhelming spectacle designed to impress and to legitimize. Streets adorned with vibrant banners and freshly cut flowers, the triumphant blare of trumpets echoing between the timbered houses and stone walls, vast cheering crowds lining the processional route, eager to glimpse their new diminutive queen. But beneath all the pageantry, the deafening noise, and the dazzling display, Isabella was still fundamentally a child, adapting with remarkable resilience but undoubtedly profound internal struggle to a new country, a new household, and a new bewildering royal role. She was formally crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey shortly thereafter. The magnificent jeweled weight of St. Edward's crown, normally borne by a formidable adult, a seasoned monarch, must have felt impossibly heavy on her small, delicate head, a literal burden on her innocent brow. This coronation, though a political necessity to legitimize her status and secure the peace, profoundly underscored the profound anomaly of her situation. A child queen, ruling absolutely nothing, yet bearing the immense symbolic burden of a nation's desperate hopes for peace and a secure, unquestioned succession. Richard II, despite the lingering, profound sorrow from the loss of Anne of Bohemia, a grief that some chroniclers suggested he never fully recovered from, contributing to his later erratic behavior, seemed to genuinely warm to his child bride. Their marriage, as was entirely customary for child unions in that era, was not consummated. Recognizing her extreme youth and the strictures of both custom and religious law, Isabella was sent to live in a series of royal residences that were more comfortable and secluded, primarily the beautiful and relatively tranquil Eltham Palace in Kent, a place designed to be a retreat from the immediate pressures and constant intrigues of the main court at Westminster. There, she was provided with her own extensive household, a small, carefully selected retinue of English ladies and servants, chosen not just for their competence, but for their discretion and kindness. Crucially, she also had a few trusted French companions, including her beloved former governess, Lady de Courcy, who provided a vital link to her past, a source of familiar language, and a profound emotional comfort in her otherwise alien surroundings. Richard visited her often, making special journeys to Eltham, taking time away from pressing state affairs. He brought her lavish toys, intricately carved wooden animals, dolls dressed in miniature court finery, delicate silver trinkets, and expensive gifts, demonstrating a genuine fondness. He treated her more like a beloved daughter or a cherished ward than a wife in the conventional sense. He reportedly called her my beautiful little wife and was consistently affectionate towards her, enjoying her innocence, her simplicity, and her gentle nature, which offered a stark contrast to the cutthroat world of politics. This unexpected tenderness between them, a bond forged out of political necessity, but blossoming into what appears to have been a genuine, if platonic, affection, adds a deeply poignant and human layer to their otherwise stark, politically driven story. Richard, a sensitive man who had known immense personal sorrow, brutal political strife, and the constant, treacherous demands of his crown, perhaps found in Isabella's untarnished, innocent presence a fleeting, untainted escape from the harsh, cynical realities of his adult world. She, in turn, a child displaced and burdened with an impossible role, may have found in him a protective figure, a kind, powerful presence in an otherwise overwhelming and unfamiliar environment. They were, in a strange and unique way, companions in a gilded cage, bound by duty, but finding genuine, if unusual, comfort in their platonic bond, a quiet solace in the storm of their respective lives. This unexpected, gentle connection would make the impending political upheaval all the more devastating for the young queen. The gathering storm, Richard's unraveling reign, and Isabella's growing awareness. While young Isabella was navigating the tender complexities of her unique new life, playing with her dolls in the sprawling manicured gardens of Eltham, and slowly, painstakingly learning the intricacies of English phrases and the bewildering nuances of courtly etiquette, the political landscape around King Richard II was growing increasingly treacherous, darkening like storm clouds on the horizon, threatening to engulf his reign. Richard was an undeniably complex monarch, a figure of profound contradictions that baffled and often infuriated his subjects and his nobles. He was often seen as an intellectual and artistic king, a genuine patron of the arts and architecture, commissioning magnificent works such as Westminster Hall's hammer beam roof, and fostering a refined, almost luxurious court culture that was sometimes seen as decadent by the more austere nobility. He harbored a deep, almost philosophical preference for peace over the brutal, costly, and endlessly draining pursuit of war, a stark contrast to his famously warlike Plantagenet ancestors who had thrived on conflict. However, beneath this refined exterior lay a deeply autocratic temperament, a ruler increasingly prone to sudden, terrifying fits of rage, and profoundly, almost pathologically, distrustful of his powerful, ambitious nobility. His hard-won peace treaty with France, secured by his controversial, politically charged marriage to Isabella, was deeply unpopular with many English barons who had for generations derived their wealth, status, and influence from the spoils of war against France. They deeply resented the financial and political concessions made to their old, despised enemy, seeing it as a betrayal of English honor. The very truce that Isabella embodied was a constant, festering source of internal division and resentment within the English realm. Richard's later reign was marked by a simmering, pervasive discontent that frequently punctuated and eventually exploded into open rebellion. His increasingly tyrannical style of governance, his arbitrary seizures of land, his reliance on forced loans that impoverished nobles, his use of blank charters or ragman rolls that allowed him to punish subjects at will, effectively circumventing traditional legal processes, his extravagant lifestyle that drained the royal coffers, and his perceived favoritism towards a small, exclusive circle of loyalists and new men, often seen as upstarts and sycophants, deeply alienated vast swathes of the ancient English aristocracy. He alienated powerful, influential figures like Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, his own uncle, a fierce advocate for war, and Henry Bolingbroke, his wealthy and popular cousin, son of the immensely powerful John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. These men, scions of the royal family, believed they had not only a greater right to influence the throne, but a moral duty to correct the king's perceived misrule and autocratic tendencies. The suspicious, brutal execution of Gloucester, who died in Calais under mysterious circumstances, and the subsequent arbitrary banishment of Bolingbroke in 1398 were fatal missteps, acts of extreme overreach that pushed the realm irrevocably closer to the precipice of open civil war. Richard, in his paranoia, had overestimated his power and underestimated the resentment he had sown. It was against this terrifying backdrop of escalating political tension, of whispers of discontent turning into outright shouts of rebellion, that Isabella, still a child, was beginning her slow, inexorable process of maturation. She was developing into a graceful, intelligent, and increasingly observant young woman, no longer entirely confined to the innocent games of the nursery. While her direct involvement in court politics was minimal, she would have sensed the shift in atmosphere. She was becoming more acutely aware of her elevated role, her immense symbolic importance as the queen, the peace bringer, even if she couldn't yet fully grasp the mortal dangers that surrounded her and her unique, increasingly embattled husband. The tender, gentle affection that had blossomed between her and Richard continued to grow, a quiet bond amidst the mounting chaos. She reportedly adored him, her loyalty a pure, untainted reflection of the love she had for the kind man who brought her dolls, wrote her letters, and treated her with respect and genuine warmth. Richard, in turn, continued to cherish her, perhaps seeing in her youth and untarnished innocence the only pure, uncomplicated loyalty he rarely found among his cynical, power-hungry adult subjects. This innocent, yet profoundly significant bond would soon face a brutal, cataclysmic test, swept away by the storm of history. In the late spring and summer of 1399, while Richard, in what would prove to be a crucial strategic error, was on a costly and unpopular military campaign in distant Ireland, pursuing a seemingly intractable conflict, Henry Bolingbroke, the banished Duke of Lancaster, seized his opportune moment. News of Richard's absence, coupled with widespread discontent over his tyrannical rule and high taxes, provided the perfect pretext. Bolingbroke returned to England from his exile in France, ostensibly to reclaim his rightful inheritance. His father, John of Gaunt, had died, and Richard had seized his vast estates, but rapidly gained widespread popular support and rallied disaffected nobles and powerful magnates to his cause. The kingdom, already weary of Richard's increasing absolutism, his punitive financial demands, and his perceived injustices, turned decisively against its king with astonishing speed and unanimity. When Richard finally returned from Ireland, exhausted and ill, expecting to crush a rebellion, he found himself utterly isolated, his royal support evaporated, his loyal forces having defected or deserted. He was captured near Flint Castle, imprisoned, and on September 29th, 1399, a date that would forever mark the end of the Plantagenet dynasty's direct male line, forced to abdicate his throne in favor of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who was then swiftly crowned King Henry IV, initiating the new Lancastrian dynasty. This was a direct usurpation, a violation of centuries of English succession law, setting a dangerous precedent for future generations. For Isabella, the news of Richard's capture, imprisonment, and forced abdication must have been utterly devastating, almost incomprehensible in its sudden, brutal finality. Her beloved husband, the King of England, her protector, the one source of stability she knew in this foreign land, was suddenly a powerless prisoner, stripped of his sacred crown, his fate uncertain. She was no longer Queen of England, but merely the Dowager Queen, a foreign child woman entangled in a catastrophic political upheaval, her entire future thrown into terrifying disarray. Her young life, previously shielded by Richard's unexpected affection and the carefully constructed royal bubble of Eltham Palace, was now brutally exposed to the raw, unforgiving, and often brutal forces of English power politics. She desperately tried to appeal to the new king, Henry IV, writing him fervent letters in her elegant French hand, pleading for permission to see Richard, to intercede on his behalf, to offer whatever solace she could. Her pleas, of course, were met with cold indifference. They were summarily ignored, seen as inconvenient rather than heartfelt. She was confined to Sunninghill Park, a royal manor in Berkshire, essentially under strict house arrest, her every movement watched by Henry IV's agents, her future hanging precariously in the balance, a political pawn once more, but now one with a vastly diminished value. The fragile tenderness she had experienced as a child queen was violently replaced by the cold, unforgiving reality of political expediency and the brutal, cynical logic of a usurper's new regime. She had lost her husband, her crown, her protector, and perhaps most painfully, her innocence, all in the space of a few tumultuous, terrifying weeks that redefined her world. Widowhood and return to France, a queen in limbo, a pawn resurfacing, the grim fate of deposed monarchs, especially those with living heirs or strong foreign connections, was always profoundly precarious in medieval Europe. A living, legitimate former king, even one who had abdicated under duress, remained a dangerous figure, a lingering threat, a convenient rallying point for any disaffected faction or ambitious noble seeking to challenge the new regime. Richard II, despite his forced abdication and imprisonment, remained exactly such a threat to the shaky legitimacy of the new King Henry IV. While the official line promulgated by the Lancastrian court was that Richard had died a natural death in Pontefract Castle in early 1400, ostensibly from melancholia or a fever, whispers of murder, of foul play, quickly circulated through England and across the Channel to the royal courts of Europe. It is widely believed by modern historians that Richard was indeed deliberately starved to death, a brutal but effective and deniable way for Henry IV to eliminate a rival without overtly spilling royal blood, which carried a greater political and moral risk, potentially invoking divine retribution or alienating the populace. For Isabella, this news, when it finally reached her in her gilded cage at Sunninghill, was utterly shattering, a confirmation of her worst fears and the final brutal severing of her last link to her old life. The man who had been her kind, affectionate husband, her only source of protection and stability in a foreign land, was now dead, brutally murdered by the very forces that had deposed him and stripped her of her crown. She was now a widow, barely 11 years old, thrust into a profound grief that belied her tender age, a child mourning a man who had become her unexpected sanctuary. Her position in England, already precarious as a former queen without power, now became utterly untenable. Henry IV, desperately needing to solidify his own shaky legitimacy on the throne, a legitimacy violently challenged by Richard's powerful French relatives and by a host of English nobles who still saw Henry as a usurper, a breaker of sacred vows, initially attempted a pragmatic, cynical solution. He proposed to marry Isabella to his eldest son, the formidable and ambitious Prince Henry, the future Henry V, who was then roughly her age, a burgeoning knight and military leader. This strategic marriage would have served multiple crucial purposes. It would have conveniently merged the two royal lines, the deposed Plantagenets and the new Lancastrians, symbolically uniting the kingdom and, crucially, legitimizing the new Lancastrian dynasty in the eyes of many. It would have also bound the powerful French court, Isabella's family, to the new English regime through Isabella herself, potentially preventing renewed hostilities. However, Isabella, despite her extreme youth, her vulnerable position as a hostage, and the immense pressure brought to bear upon her, possessed a surprising strength of will, a quiet dignity that belied her years, and a fierce, unwavering loyalty to her deceased husband, Richard. She vehemently refused the proposal, displaying a remarkable defiance for a child of her status. She is reported to have declared that she would rather die than marry the son of Richard's murderer, the man she held responsible for his death and her own profound loss. This act of courage from a child queen, a powerless hostage, was truly remarkable, a testament to her genuine, if unusual, bond with Richard, and perhaps a burgeoning political and moral awareness that transcended her years, recognizing the deep injustice of his fate. The French court, meanwhile, was predictably enraged by Richard's brutal deposition and subsequent death. They publicly denounced Henry IV as a usurper and a regicide. They demanded Isabella's immediate return to France, seeing her continued presence in England not only as an affront to French royal dignity, but also as a potential bargaining chip in a renewed conflict, a symbol around which they could rally support for a renewed war. Charles VI, despite his increasingly severe bouts of madness, still had powerful dukes, particularly Louis of Orleans, his brother and Isabella's uncle, who could press the issue diplomatically and militarily. After protracted, often tense negotiations, and with Isabella herself steadfastly refusing to marry Prince Henry, creating a diplomatic stalemate, Henry IV finally, reluctantly, relented. He understood that holding her against her will and against the demands of France was more trouble than it was worth, especially as he faced growing rebellion at home. In July 1401, Isabella, now 12 years old, a young woman on the cusp of adolescence, was finally allowed to return to France. Her departure from England was a quiet, somber affair, devoid of the pomp and pageantry that had marked her grand arrival 5 years earlier. There were no cheering crowds, no celebratory banners. She left behind the land where she had been a child queen, a beloved ward, and then a grieving, defiant widow. Her brief, tumultuous reign, a mere footnote in English history, a silent testament to the fleeting nature of power and the brutal realities of royal life. Back in France, Isabella found herself once again at the mercy of ruthless political machinations, but this time in her cherished homeland, albeit one profoundly changed. Her father, Charles VI, continued to suffer from increasingly severe and debilitating bouts of madness, often believing himself to be made of glass, or denying his royal identity, rendering him unfit to rule. This tragic condition plunged the entire French court into bitter, escalating internal divisions, culminating in the devastating conflict between the powerful Armagnacs, who supported the royal family, and the Duke of Orleans, and the rival Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, two ruthless factions vying for control of the kingdom, leading to widespread chaos and violence. Isabella, still a princess of immense dynastic value, her lineage still impeccable, her connection to two great thrones undeniable, was soon inevitably put back on the marriage market. At the age of 15, in June 1406, she was married to her cousin, Charles, Duke of Orleans, a prominent figure in the Armagnac faction, a renowned poet, a cultured man, and a nephew of the Mad King. This marriage, unlike her first to Richard, was intended to be a genuine union, a full partnership designed to produce heirs and cement crucial alliances within a fractured France. It was a chance, perhaps, for a more normal life, for affection, companionship, and a family life she had not known as a child bride. However, fate continued to deal Isabella a cruel, relentless hand. The political instability in France was rapidly escalating into open, brutal civil war, the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict tearing the country apart. Her new husband, Charles of Orleans, though a refined and intellectual man, was deeply and dangerously embroiled in these violent factional struggles, constantly at risk, constantly negotiating for power. Their marriage, destined to be short-lived, lasted only a few brief, tumultuous years. In September 1409, at the tragically young age of 20, Isabella died in childbirth, succumbing to the perilous realities that so often claimed royal women of her era, even those with the best medical care. She gave birth to her only child, a daughter named Jeanne, just before her own life was extinguished. Just as her life had begun as a political pawn of peace between two nations, it ended prematurely, a victim of the inevitable and often fatal risks of childbirth, her potential utterly unrealized, her quiet dignity and resilience a testament to a life lived under extraordinary, unrelenting pressure. She was buried in the Abbey of Saint Lomer at Blois, France, far from the English throne she briefly occupied, a continent away from the man who had been her kind, if unusual, first husband. Her daughter, Jeanne of Valois, would go on to survive and marry John II of Alençon, and her descendants would eventually play a significant, if often overlooked, role in later French history, continuing her lineage. But Isabella herself, the child bride, the widowed queen, the young mother who died too soon, was largely forgotten by English history, her narrative overshadowed by the dramatic, more politically significant reigns of Richard II and Henry IV, and by the later, more historically successful marriage of her younger sister, Catherine of Valois. Catherine, incidentally, would become the mother of the future Henry VI of England, solidifying the English claim to the French throne, and tragically leading to a renewed devastating phase of the 100 Years' War. Ironically, the very conflict Isabella's childhood marriage was specifically designed to end. Her life was a sacrifice that ultimately failed in its grand political purpose, leaving her a footnote rather than a central celebrated character in the annals of history, a quiet tragedy lost amidst the clamor of kings and battles. Conclusion: the echo of a forgotten queen, a testament to resilience, the story of Isabella of Valois, often relegated to the dusty, overlooked margins of history as the forgotten Queen of England, is far more than a simple chronicle of a royal marriage or a mere footnote in dynastic history. It is in fact a profound, poignant, and often heartbreaking exploration of the intersection of power, the brutal realities of child marriages in a pre-modern era, the fragility of innocence in a cynical political world, and the crushing, relentless weight of political destiny that bore down upon even the youngest and most vulnerable members of royalty. Her extraordinary, yet tragically brief life serves as a stark, illuminating reminder of the inescapable realities faced by medieval royal women, particularly child brides, who were born into a world where their bodies, their hearts, and their very futures were never truly their own. They were, instead, meticulously groomed instruments of statecraft, living diplomatic tools to be meticulously wielded by powerful men in the relentless pursuit of territory, peace, alliance, or dynasty, their personal desires utterly irrelevant. Isabella was married at 6, a mere wisp of a child, forced to wear the impossibly heavy crown of a queen, burdened from infancy with the immense, almost unbearable hopes for peace between two ancient, deeply entrenched, warring nations. She experienced the tender, unexpected affection of an older husband, Richard II, a kindness that must have been a beacon of warmth and stability in her bewildering new world, a genuine affection that blossomed despite the artificiality of their union. Yet this fragile happiness was brutally short-lived. She was forced to witness him violently deposed, unjustly imprisoned, and ultimately, by all accounts, murdered. She then found herself, barely a teenager, a vulnerable dowager queen, caught between warring factions in her own homeland, a pawn to be traded and married once more, a tool for further alliances. Her life culminated tragically young in the very act of fulfilling her fundamental royal duty, producing an heir, a task that demanded her life. Her brief, tumultuous reign as Queen of England, followed by her courageous, defiant refusal to marry Henry IV's son, an act of remarkable personal agency and moral fortitude for a girl of her age and status, especially when her life was essentially at the mercy of her captors, and her subsequent return to a France consumed by brutal civil war, culminating in her premature death in childbirth, all powerfully illustrate the profound personal cost of royal politics. She was not a primary political actor, but she was a silent observer, a bewildered, often helpless participant in some of the most tumultuous and dramatic events in both English and French history. She bore witness to the dramatic downfall of a king, a symbol of a fragile peace that ultimately shattered, giving way to renewed, devastating conflict. Yet, despite the dramatic contours of her life, the extraordinary circumstances that shaped her every breath, her inherent dignity, and her quiet resilience, she remains largely forgotten by popular history. Her narrative is consistently eclipsed by the larger-than-life figures of the kings she was bound to: the mercurial Richard II, the usurping Henry IV, the conquering Henry V, and by the more celebrated, politically impactful queens who followed in her wake, particularly her own sister. The lingering echo of Isabella's life resonates as a powerful, unsettling cautionary tale. It challenges us as modern observers to look beyond the grand narratives of battles, treaties, and sweeping dynastic shifts, which often fill the pages of history books. Instead, it compels us to consider, with empathy and a profound sense of human connection, the often overlooked human cost, the personal tragedies, and the quiet, extraordinary resilience of those individuals, particularly women and children, whose lives were utterly shaped, often brutally, by forces far beyond their control, by decisions made by powerful men. Her story, though forgotten by many, despite its inherent drama and pathos, despite its poignant beauty and chilling realities, deserves to be remembered. It stands as a powerful testament to innocence thrust into the crucible of power, a life defined by relentless, unchosen duty, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming, profoundly difficult, and ultimately tragic circumstance. She was a child bride, a forgotten queen, but a woman whose quiet strength, whose brief moments of affection and whose ultimate tragic fate left an indelible, if often overlooked, mark on the complex, often cruel tapestry of history